They ordered her to remove her jacket for a routine inspection, snickered as she unzipped the heavy fabric, nudged each other with their elbows, muttering crude jokes under their breath. One even held up his phone, pretending to adjust his watch while angling the camera, and then she turned around. That's when Commander Sarah Mitchell walked through the training facility doors. Everything stopped dead because the ink stretched across her shoulder blades wasn't some random design from a tattoo parlor. It was a classified unit designation from an operation that officially never happened. And in that instant, the soldiers who had been humiliating her weren't laughing anymore. Want to know what happened when the commander recognized those markings? Drop a comment telling us what branch of military you or your family served in. Then hit subscribe because we upload powerful stories like this every single day. Now back to the moment that changed everything. She walked into Fort Braxton training facility like she owned the place. Not with arrogance or attitude, just with the quiet confidence of someone who had done this exact routine hundreds of times before. The name was Elena Vasquez, and at first glance, she looked like any other civilian contractor. Mid-40s, maybe pushing closer to 50. Dark hair streaked with premature silver pulled back in a simple ponytail. Wearing a standard-issue military contractor jacket that had seen better days, and combat boots that showed actual wear from real field work. She carried a weathered clipboard and a canvas messenger bag that looked like it had been through multiple deployments. But assumptions are dangerous territory when you're dealing with people whose real stories are locked away in classified files. The afternoon sun had turned Fort Braxton into a sauna. Heat waves shimmered off the asphalt training grounds and inside Building C. The air conditioning fought a losing battle against the Texas heat that seemed determined to bake everything in sight. The smell of gun oil mixed with concrete dust and that particular combination of sweat and determination that every soldier knows by heart. Drill sergeants barked commands in the distance. Boots pounded against pavement in synchronized rhythm. And somewhere nearby, a radio crackled with communications that sounded like coded poetry to civilian ears. Elena signed in at the security checkpoint with movements that were precise and practiced. Her handwriting was the kind you see from people who had filled out mission reports in dusty forward operating bases and signed equipment logs while incoming. Mortars screamed overhead. Clean, efficient block letters with no wasted motion or decorative flourishes. The desk sergeant, a grizzled staff sergeant named Rodriguez, with 22 years of service etched into the lines around his eyes, glanced at her paperwork with the casual interest of someone who processed dozens of contractors every week. Psychological evaluation protocols for the new recruits, he read aloud. Haven't seen your company here before. Last contractor couldn't tell the difference between combat stress and basic training nerves. I'm not the last contractor, Elena replied simply. Something in her tone made Rodriguez look up from his computer screen. The way she carried herself, the way she spoke with quiet authority instead of trying to prove anything. It reminded him of the old-school military psychologists he'd worked with in Afghanistan, the ones who could spot PTSD before it showed up on any official assessment and knew how to talk soldiers through the kind of trauma that didn't fit into neat diagnostic categories. Well, the training unit is in Bay 12. Commander Mitchell is running them through advanced combat scenarios today, but she's expecting you for the afternoon evaluations. Elena nodded once and made her way through the facility corridors. She wasn't trying to be invisible, but she wasn't announcing her presence either. Just another civilian contractor doing another job on another Tuesday that felt identical to every other Tuesday in the endless cycle of military training and preparation. That's when Staff Sergeant Thompson decided she looked like easy entertainment. Thompson was 26 years old and convinced he ran the entire universe because he wore sergeant stripes and had survived 2 deployments without learning much of anything except how to push around people who couldn't push back. Fresh out of advanced leadership school, assigned to his first training command position, still believing that volume equaled authority and intimidation was the same thing as respect. His uniform was pressed sharp enough to slice paper, his boots polished to mirror perfection, and his ego larger than the entire state of Texas. He'd been having a frustrating month. Failed his first efficiency evaluation, got written up by his commanding officer for improper treatment of junior enlisted personnel, and watched 3 of his peers get promoted to the next rank while he remained stuck in the same position, looking for someone to take out his disappointment on. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, not bothering to walk over to where she stood, making her cross the room to reach him like she was some kind of servant. "You here for the psych evaluations?" Elena looked up from her clipboard, her eyes calm and direct. No hostility, no challenge, just the quiet attention of someone who had learned to assess situations before they escalated into something more complicated. "That's correct. I'll need access to the training bay and the personnel files for this afternoon session." She pulled a folder from her messenger bag, handed it over without any comment or explanation. Thompson made an elaborate show of examining the documentation, squinting at official seals and signatures, like he was some kind of expert in contractor credentials instead of someone who barely understood his own job responsibilities. Behind him, 4 other training personnel had gathered, drawn by that magnetic attraction of potential drama that seemed to follow certain types of personalities through military life. Corporal Danny Morrison, barely 21 years old, with soft hands that had never handled anything more complex than video game controllers before his military career began. Private First Class Kevin Chang, who spent most of his free time complaining about military food and posting workout videos on social media platforms. Specialist Lisa Rodriguez, who should have known better but was too busy trying to fit in with the group dynamic to speak up for what was right. And Senior Airman Jake Williams, who had enough experience to recognize inappropriate behavior but lacked the backbone to intervene when it mattered most. "Says here you're cleared for psychological assessments," Thompson announced like he had discovered some kind of major discrepancy in her paperwork. "But that doesn't include access to classified personnel records or sensitive training information. Psychological assessments require access to complete service records," Elena replied evenly, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone who had explained basic procedures countless times before. "Standard protocol since 2019 update to military mental health regulations." Chang laughed, a sharp sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "She knows the regulations better than you do, Thompson." But Thompson wasn't backing down from the confrontation. He had an audience now, and in his limited worldview, that meant doubling down on whatever power play he had started. Plus there was something about this woman that irritated him on a fundamental level. Maybe it was the way she didn't seem impressed by his uniform or rank. Maybe it was how she answered his questions without the deference he thought he deserved from civilian contractors. "Well, regulations have been updated again," he said, folding his arms across his chest and trying to project an image of official authority. "New security protocols regarding potential espionage risks. Can't have unauthorized recording devices or surveillance equipment near sensitive training operations." The facility got quieter around them. Not completely silent, but quieter in that particular way that happens when people sense a situation crossing important lines. Training continued in the distance, but conversations dropped to whispers and people began paying attention to the drama unfolding near the main desk. Rodriguez looked up from his administrative work, his expression darkening as he recognized the trajectory of Thompson's behavior. Williams shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, suddenly wanting distance from whatever was about to happen next. But Thompson was banking on Elena not knowing the real regulations or not wanting to cause enough of a scene to challenge his manufactured authority. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Elena's voice remained level, professional, carrying no hint of the storm that was building behind her calm exterior. Security sweep. Upper body. Standard procedure for uncleared personnel entering restricted. Training areas. That was completely fabricated, and everyone within earshot knew it was fabricated. Rodriguez's head snapped up from his paperwork, his face flushing with anger at the blatant lie being told by one of his subordinates. Chang pulled out his smartphone, angling it low toward the unfolding confrontation. "This is going to be hilarious," he whispered to Morrison, who was grinning like Christmas morning had arrived early. "Put that device away immediately," Rodriguez barked. But Chang just shrugged and kept the camera rolling, convinced that his recording was going to become social media gold. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena stood there for a long moment, clipboard in her hands, looking at this kid who thought he could humiliate her because she was older, quieter, and appeared to be alone in a room full of people who should have been protecting her instead of enabling harassment. She could have demanded to speak with Commander Mitchell, could have filed an official complaint through proper channels, could have walked away and let someone else deal with the entitled child playing dress-up soldier. Instead, she set her clipboard down on the nearest desk, reached for the zipper of her contractor jacket, and began pulling it down slowly. "Jesus Christ, she's actually doing it," Morrison whispered, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and perverted excitement. The heavy fabric parted with the soft whisper of worn cotton and hidden zippers, revealing a plain black long-sleeved shirt underneath. No jewelry, no hidden recording devices, just the practical undergarments of someone who dressed for function rather than fashion or appearance. She pulled the jacket completely off her shoulders, folded it with military precision, and set it aside on the desk. Then she stood there with her arms at her sides, waiting for the next humiliation with the patience of someone who had endured far worse treatment and survived it all. The training personnel stared, not with respect or professionalism, but with the ugly satisfaction of people who had found someone they could push around without facing any meaningful consequences. Thompson was grinning now, drunk on his perceived power and the attention from his audience. "Turn around," he commanded, his voice carrying the false authority of someone who had never actually earned the right to give orders to anyone who mattered. Complete inspection, and that's when she turned around. The black shirt was fitted, practical, and it clung to her back in a way that revealed everything, including the intricate inkwork that covered her shoulder blades like a roadmap to places most people couldn't imagine. It wasn't decorative artwork from some downtown tattoo parlor. It was 4 distinct elements burned into skin with military precision and meaning that went deeper than flesh. At the top, between her shoulder blades, was a stylized eagle with wings, spread wide, but not the standard military eagle most people recognized. This one had talons gripping a lightning bolt, and beneath it, numbers that looked like grid coordinates, Delta-7-7-9-Alpha. Below that, a series of small symbols that resembled abbreviated mission markers, and at the base, just visible, above the neckline of her shirt, the silhouette of a helicopter surrounded by stars that weren't randomly placed decorations. Most of the people in that room didn't understand what they were looking at. Just some old ink from some old soldier, trying to relive whatever glory days she thought she had earned. Chang was still recording, zooming in on the markings with his phone camera. "Check out the contractor's war stories," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice dripping with the kind of disrespect that comes from never having faced real consequences. Morrison laughed nervously, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. Probably got those done at some strip mall parlor when she was reserves or National Guard. But Rodriguez, who had grown up in a military family and heard his father's stories about classified operations that never appeared in official histories, felt something cold and familiar settle in his stomach. Because he had seen markings similar to those before, In old photographs his father had shown him before burning them in the backyard fire pit, unit identifiers for groups that didn't appear on organizational charts, mission markers for operations that were classified beyond the level where normal people were allowed to ask questions. And he was starting to realize that Elena Vasquez wasn't just some random civilian contractor who had wandered into their facility to conduct routine psychological evaluations. That's when Commander Sarah Mitchell walked through the main doors with 2 senior officers flanking her sides, conducting what should have been a routine inspection of training operations. The folder in her hand hit the concrete floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the entire facility like a gunshot. Her escort officers, a major and a lieutenant colonel, looked at her in confusion and concern, then followed her gaze to the woman standing in her underwear in the middle of their training facility. "Sweet Mother of God," Mitchell whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying enough weight to make everyone within 50 feet stop what they were doing and pay attention. Because that eagle wasn't just a tattoo. It was the unit insignia for Task Force Phantom, a psychological operations group that had been disbanded in 2015 after completing missions, so sensitive that even their existence was classified at levels that required special congressional oversight. The coordinates weren't random numbers. They marked an operation in Syria, 2014, where 3 military psychologists had been embedded with special operations forces for a mission that involved extracting high-value intelligence targets through advanced interrogation and psychological manipulation techniques. An operation that had gone so completely sideways that it was buried in classification levels that most people with security clearances weren't authorized to know existed, and those stars around the helicopter weren't decorative elements. They represented successful extractions under fire, each one marking a time when someone had been pulled out of an impossible situation and brought home alive when the official reports said there were no survivors. Mitchell had been a captain, then working intelligence coordination at Joint Base Lewis McChord. She had seen the classified after-action reports before they disappeared into archives that required clearance levels she didn't possess. She knew about the helicopter that had crashed during an extraction gone wrong, knew about the psychological operations team that was supposed to have been killed in the wreckage, and she definitely knew about the 3 specialists who had somehow made it back to friendly territory after being declared clear for 72 hours. She also knew that those 3 specialists had been given new identities, comprehensive background, scrubs, and explicit orders to never speak about their service in ways that could compromise ongoing operations or endanger assets still in the field. Elena Vasquez wasn't just some contractor with a psychology degree. She was a ghost, the kind of operational ghost that defense departments created when missions went catastrophically wrong, and heroes needed to disappear for the safety of everyone involved. The kind that received new identities, sanitized records, and strict instructions about maintaining cover stories that would protect classified methodologies and personnel. But Skin remembered what paperwork forgot, and the ink on her back told a story that no amount of bureaucratic erasure could eliminate completely. Thompson was still grinning, still playing to his audience of junior personnel who were too inexperienced to understand the magnitude of what was unfolding in front of them. "See anything you'd like to report, ma'am?" he asked with the kind of smugness that comes from thinking you've successfully humiliated someone who can't fight back. Shine was still recording with his smartphone, now panning slowly across the tattoo details like he was documenting some kind of trophy for his social media followers. "This is definitely going viral," he muttered, already imagining the likes and shares his video was going to generate once he posted it with some clever caption about military contractors and their delusions of grandeur. Elena began turning back. Around, her movements unhurried and professional, like she was completing a task that had been assigned to her by someone with legitimate authority rather than responding to harassment from someone who had no business making such demands. Her face showed no embarrassment, no anger, no demand for apologies or explanations. Just the quiet dignity of someone who had endured interrogations by actual enemies and survived torture that would break most people's minds. That's when Mitchell found her voice, and the words came out carrying the kind of command authority that had been forged in combat zones where hesitation meant people died. "Stand down, Sergeant Thompson." The phrase cut through the facility noise like a blade through silk. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every piece of equipment went quiet. Even the distant sounds of training exercises seemed to pause in recognition of command voice being used in deadly earnest. Thompson spun around, his face cycling through several shades of pale as he realized exactly who was watching his performance and how much trouble he had just created for himself. "Ma'am, I was just conducting a routine security verification according to updated protocols that came down from," I said. "Stand down." Mitchell's voice now carried the kind of authority that came from making life and death decisions in places where the rules of engagement were written in blood and consequences were measured in body bags rather than performance evaluations. She walked across the facility floor with deliberate steps, her eyes never leaving Elena's face, studying features that she was starting to recognize from classified briefings she had attended years earlier. The two officers accompanying her, Major Patricia Hendricks and Lieutenant Colonel Robert Stone, hung back near the entrance. They didn't understand what was happening, but they recognized the expression on their commander's face. The same look she got when encrypted communications arrived from Washington with mission parameters that couldn't be discussed outside of secure facilities. "Ma'am," Mitchell said quietly, her voice dropping to a tone that was meant for Elena. "Alone, you can get dressed." Elena nodded once, a small movement that acknowledged the command without showing gratitude or relief, and began pulling her jacket back on with the same unhurried precision she had used to remove it. No shame, no anger, no demands for explanations or apologies from the people who had humiliated her. Just the quiet professionalism of someone who had learned to maintain dignity under circumstances that would destroy most people's ability to function. Chang was still holding his phone up, still recording what he thought was going to be his ticket to internet fame. "Ma'am, should I upload this to the unit social media page? I think it shows good security protocols in action, and you will delete that footage immediately, or I will have you court-martialed for recording classified personnel without proper authorization." Mitchell's words hit Chang like a physical blow. His hands started shaking as he fumbled with his phone, suddenly understanding that he had recorded something that could end his military career before it had really begun. Classified? But she's just a civilian contractor who… Delete it now, Corporal Chang. Every frame, every backup, every copy you think you might have saved somewhere else. And if I discover that any portion of that recording exists anywhere after this conversation, you'll be spending the next several years in military prison, learning about what happens to people who compromise operational security. Chang's face went white as desert sand. His fingers moved frantically across his phone screen, deleting the video file, clearing it from his recently deleted folder, and removing it from any cloud backup services he might have been using. When he was finished, he shoved the device back into his pocket like it was radioactive material that might contaminate everything around it. When Elena was fully dressed again, Mitchell stepped closer, moving into that personal space that military officers used when conversations needed to remain private, even in crowded rooms. Task Force Phantom was officially disbanded in 2015, she said quietly, her voice carrying just far enough for Elena to hear. "Officially," Elena replied, and that single word carried more weight than most people's entire autobiographies. "There are no official records of your psychological operations service in Syria. That was the entire point of the program design." Mitchell studied Elena's face more carefully now, seeing details that most people would miss entirely. The way her eyes tracked movement without appearing to watch anything specific. The slight scarring on her knuckles that came from close-quarters combat training. The way she held her weight balanced on both feet, always ready to move in any direction without telegraphing her intentions. The almost invisible calluses on her trigger finger that spoke of weapons handling under extreme conditions. "You're not supposed to exist anymore," Mitchell said, her voice carrying a mixture of respect and concern for what Elena's presence might mean for ongoing operations. "Neither is that modified Osprey in Hangar 18, but here we are having this conversation," Elena replied calmly. That observation got Mitchell's complete attention because the aircraft in Hangar 18 was classified at levels that required special congressional notification. And there was absolutely no way a civilian contractor should know what was hidden under that camouflage netting, unless her clearance levels ran deeper than any paperwork indicated, unless she was exactly who Mitchell was starting to suspect she might be, unless Elena Vasquez was a cover identity for someone whose real service record was buried so deep that even people with top-secret clearances couldn't access the relevant files. Mitchell turned to face the assembled training personnel who were watching this exchange with the growing understanding that they had stepped into something far beyond their comprehension or authority level. Thompson looked like he wanted to disappear through the concrete floor. Chang was pale as chalk and appeared to be having trouble breathing normally. Morrison kept glancing between Mitchell and Elena like he was trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit together in any way that made sense. "Everyone out," Mitchell commanded, her voice carrying the kind of finality that ended discussions before they could begin. "Clear this facility immediately." "Ma'am, we have scheduled training rotations and equipment maintenance that needs to be completed according to the daily operational schedule," Rodriguez started, trying to maintain some semblance of normal procedure. "I don't care if you have the Secretary of Defense scheduled for equipment inspection. Clear this building now. Anyone who discusses what just happened will be reassigned to kitchen duty until their enlistment expires, and that's if they're lucky enough to avoid more serious consequences." The training personnel scattered like leaves in a hurricane wind. Thompson finally tried to salvage something from the wreckage of his authority and reputation. "Ma'am, I was just following proper security protocols. The new directives that came down from higher command specifically state that uncleared personnel should be subject to enhanced screening procedures before being granted access to sensitive areas." "Staff Sergeant Thompson," Mitchell's voice dropped to the kind of quiet that somehow made it more terrifying than shouting. "Report to my office at 1500 hours. Bring your immediate supervisor, your training officer, and a complete written report, explaining exactly what protocols you think you were following and where you learned them." Thompson's face went completely white. A meeting with the base commander that included his entire chain of command usually meant one thing: paperwork that would follow him for the rest of his military career, assuming he still had a military career after the meeting concluded. When the facility was empty except for Mitchell, her two accompanying officers, and Elena, the commander pulled out her secure communication device and placed a call to a number that wasn't listed in any directory. "Military or civilian? This is Mitchell at Fort Braxton. I need immediate verification on contractor Elena Vasquez, background authentication, clearance confirmation, priority alpha verification." She listened for several minutes, her expression growing more serious with each piece of information she received. "I understand. And her current operational status?" Another pause, longer this time. "Copy that. What about potential compromise of her cover identity?" A final pause. "Understood completely. Thank you." She ended the call and looked at Elena, who had retrieved her clipboard and was calmly reviewing her evaluation schedule like nothing extraordinary had happened in the last 20 minutes. "They tell me you have clearance levels I'm not authorized to ask about," Mitchell said carefully. "Then don't ask," Elena replied simply, her tone carrying no hostility or challenge, just the practical directness of someone who understood operational security requirements. "But I can provide you with whatever support you need to ensure this situation." doesn't compromise ongoing missions or endanger personnel who are still in active service. What I need, Mitchell said, is to understand how to protect someone whose cover identity may have just been compromised by a group of junior enlisted personnel with smartphones and social media accounts. Elena looked up from her clipboard, and for the first time since walking into the facility, she smiled. It wasn't a happy smile or a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that special operations personnel developed after surviving missions. That officially never happened. Commander, I've maintained this cover identity for 8 years while living in 12 different cities, working for 7 different government contractors, and conducting psychological evaluations on personnel, with security clearances that require congressional oversight. A few training personnel with bad judgment and poor impulse control aren't going to compromise anything that matters. Major Hendricks stepped forward, confusion clear in her voice and posture. Ma'am, I don't understand what's happening here. Who exactly is this contractor? And why are we treating her like she's some kind of classified asset? Major, you don't need to understand the specifics, Mitchell replied, her tone making it clear that further questions would not be welcome. What you need to understand is that Ms. Vasquez has whatever authorization she requires to complete her work here, and that no one under my command will interfere with her mission again. After what just happened, Elena said quietly, do you want me to continue with the scheduled evaluations, or would you prefer to bring in someone else who doesn't carry the same potential complications? Mitchell considered the question seriously. Elena's cover had been compromised at least partially. Her real background was now known to several junior personnel, who might not understand the importance of keeping classified information secure. The smart move from a security standpoint would be to terminate her contract and bring in someone with a cleaner cover identity. But as Mitchell looked at Elena's evaluation materials, she realized something important. The psychological assessment protocols Elena was supposed to implement weren't standard contractor work. They were specialized evaluation techniques designed for personnel who had been exposed to classified operations, advanced combat scenarios, and psychological stressors that normal military counselors weren't trained to handle, the kind of evaluations that required someone who understood trauma from the inside, who could recognize the signs of operational stress that didn't fit into standard diagnostic categories, who could assess whether someone was psychologically fit for missions that officially didn't exist. Elena wasn't just qualified to do this work. She might be the only person available who was qualified to do it properly. You stay, Mitchell decided, but we do this differently from now on. You get an escort officer, full facility access, and anyone who gives you problems answers to me directly. For the next 4 hours, Elena worked with the kind of quiet competence that made experienced military officers take notice and remember why they had chosen careers in service rather than civilian employment. She didn't just conduct psychological evaluations according to standard military protocols. She understood the deeper currents that ran beneath surface behaviors, could spot the early warning signs of combat stress that wouldn't show up on standardized assessments for months, and possessed an intuitive grasp of how different personality types responded to the specific pressures of military training and deployment. She worked like someone who had conducted these same evaluations in forward operating bases while mortar fell in the distance, who had assessed the psychological fitness of operators before missions where failure meant torture and death, who had signed off on mental health clearances, knowing that her signature was a promise written in other people's blood. Major Hendricks had been assigned as her escort officer, initially viewing the duty as an unwelcome distraction from her normal administrative responsibilities. But as she watched Elena work through the afternoon evaluation sessions, Hendricks began to understand that she was observing something extraordinary. Elena's interview techniques went far beyond the standard question and answer formats that most military psychologists employed. She could read body language with the precision of someone who had learned to detect deception in life or death situations, could identify stress responses that indicated deeper psychological issues, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to make people feel comfortable enough to reveal problems they had been hiding from other counselors. Private Martinez, a 19-year-old recruit from East Los Angeles who had been flagged for potential behavioral issues, spent 40 minutes with Elena discussing childhood trauma that he had never revealed to anyone in his family, let alone to military personnel. By the end of their session, Elena had identified the root causes of his anger management problems and developed a treatment plan that would help him channel his aggression into productive military service rather than destructive behavior patterns. Specialist Johnson, a 23-year-old communications technician who had been struggling with anxiety attacks during high-pressure training exercises, walked out of her evaluation session with practical coping strategies that she could implement immediately, and a referral for specialized therapy that would address the underlying causes of her stress responses. Sergeant Williams, a combat veteran with 2 tours in Afghanistan who had been exhibiting signs of post-traumatic stress that weren't severe enough for medical discharge but were affecting his job performance, spent an hour with Elena discussing experiences that he had never been able to articulate to other mental health professionals. Elena's evaluation reports were thorough, professional, and contained recommendations that demonstrated a level of understanding about military psychology that went far beyond what most civilian contractors could provide. She identified patterns of behavior that indicated potential problems before they became serious enough to affect unit cohesion or mission effectiveness. She recognized the difference between normal stress responses and pathological conditions that required immediate intervention. She understood how different combat experiences affected different personality types, and she could predict with remarkable accuracy which personnel would thrive under pressure and which ones needed additional support to function effectively in high-stress environments. Hendricks found herself taking notes during the evaluation sessions, not because she was required to document Elena's work, but because she was learning assessment techniques that weren't taught in any military psychology courses she had attended. Word of Elena's competence had started spreading through the facility in that particular way that military gossip traveled when it carried genuine importance rather than simple entertainment value. Quietly through training rotations and duty shifts, each conversation carrying a little more weight and respect than the last. By the time Elena was halfway through her scheduled evaluations, senior non-commissioned officers were finding excuses to walk past the interview rooms where she was conducting her sessions. Master Sergeant Patricia Davis, who had been counseling military personnel for 15 years and had developed a reputation for being able to help soldiers through the most difficult psychological challenges, stopped by to observe Elena's interview techniques with a recruit who had been exhibiting signs of severe depression. Davis didn't interfere with the session, just watched quietly from the observation area as Elena guided the young soldier through a conversation that revealed the specific triggers for his emotional distress and developed practical strategies for managing his symptoms while maintaining his military effectiveness. "How did you know to ask about his relationship with his father?" Davis asked quietly when the session concluded. Most of us would have focused on his recent performance issues or his social adjustment problems. Elena was packing up her evaluation materials with the same methodical precision she had demonstrated throughout the day. Military psychology isn't just about identifying problems. It's about understanding the life experiences that create vulnerabilities under specific types of stress. His father was career Army, deployed constantly, emotionally unavailable. The recruit joined to prove he could succeed where his father failed, but the military environment triggers all his abandonment issues. Davis had been conducting psychological evaluations for over a decade, but she was learning approaches to assessment that she had never considered. This wasn't textbook knowledge or academic theory. This was field experience earned in places where understanding human psychology could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, where reading people correctly was a survival skill rather than a professional competency. Commander. Mitchell watched from her office as Elena completed her final evaluation of the day. The recruit she was interviewing was Corporal Thompson's younger brother, Private Danny Thompson, who had requested psychological counseling after witnessing his brother's humiliation earlier that afternoon. Elena spent 90 minutes with the younger Thompson, helping him process his feelings of embarrassment and confusion about his siblings' behavior, while ensuring that family loyalty didn't interfere with his own military development. When Elena finished her work, her final report contained detailed assessments of 12 military personnel, identification of 3 individuals who required immediate mental health intervention, recommendations for advanced training modifications that would improve overall unit psychological resilience, and a comprehensive analysis of facility-wide stress patterns that could affect long-term mission readiness. Mitchell read the report twice, then called her superior officer to discuss Elena's findings and recommendations. "Sir, the contractor's psychological assessment identified systemic issues in our training program that could affect deployment readiness for the entire unit," Mitchell explained during her secure communication. Her recommendations include modifications to our stress inoculation protocols, adjustments to our leadership development programs, and implementation of preventive mental health measures that could significantly improve our personnel retention rates. The conversation lasted 20 minutes, with Mitchell's superior asking detailed questions about Elena's methodology, her findings, and her professional background. When the call concluded, Mitchell had authorization to implement Elena's recommendations and to request her return for follow-up evaluations in 30 days. But more importantly, she had confirmation that Elena's work was being taken seriously at command levels that didn't usually pay attention to routine. Contractor reports. Elena was preparing to leave the facility when Master Sergeant Davis approached her with a question that had been troubling her throughout the afternoon. "Ma'am, I've been doing this work for 15 years, and I've never seen assessment techniques like the ones you used today. Where did you learn to read people with that level of accuracy?" Elena shouldered her messenger bag and looked out at the training grounds, where young soldiers were completing their daily exercises, trusting their psychological fitness evaluations to people they would never meet. "You learn to read people when their lives depend on your ability to understand what they're not telling you," she said quietly. "When mistakes in judgment get people killed, you develop skills that most psychology textbooks never mention." "Overseas?" Davis asked carefully, recognizing that she might be asking about experiences that Elena wasn't authorized to discuss. "Different places, different circumstances," Elena replied, her tone making it clear that further questions wouldn't be answered. "But the principles remain the same. People reveal their psychological state through patterns of behavior that most observers never notice. Trauma creates specific response signatures. Stress manifests in predictable ways if you know what to look for." Davis nodded, understanding that she was receiving insights from someone whose psychological training had been earned under conditions that she couldn't imagine. Elena's knowledge wasn't academic or theoretical. It was operational intelligence gathered in situations where understanding human psychology was a matter of life and death rather than career advancement or professional development. As Elena walked toward the facility exit, she encountered Staff Sergeant Thompson waiting near the main desk. His dress uniform was perfect, but his hands were shaking slightly, and his face showed the kind of stress that came from spending hours contemplating the destruction of everything he had worked to achieve in his military career. His meeting with Commander Mitchell had lasted 2 hours and had included his immediate supervisor, his training officer, and a representative from the Inspector General's office. "Ma'am," Thompson said quietly, his voice carrying none of the arrogance or authority he had displayed earlier that day. I wanted to apologize for my behavior this afternoon. I was completely out of line, and I understand that my actions were inappropriate and potentially harmful to you and to the mission of this facility. Elena stopped and looked at him with the same calm attention she had shown during her evaluation sessions. No anger, no satisfaction at his obvious distress, just the professional interest of someone who understood that teaching moments were more valuable than punishment for its own sake. What did you learn today, Sergeant Thompson? Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The question caught him off guard. He had expected her to accept his apology, or reject it, or lecture him about respect and professionalism. He hadn't expected her to turn the moment into an educational opportunity. I learned that assumptions about people can be dangerous, he said slowly, working through thoughts that were still forming in his mind. That rank and authority don't give you the right to humiliate someone. That there are things about people's backgrounds in service that I don't understand and shouldn't pretend to judge. What else? Elena asked, her tone suggesting that his answer was incomplete. Thompson was quiet for a moment, considering experiences from the day that had challenged everything he thought he understood about military hierarchy and professional relationships. I learned that quiet competence is more valuable than loud authority. That real leadership means protecting people who can't protect themselves. That the uniform is supposed to represent something better than what I demonstrated today. Elena nodded once, a small movement that acknowledged his insights without offering forgiveness or absolution. Those are important lessons, Sergeant. Make sure you remember them when you're in positions of authority over people who can't fight back. She continued toward the exit, leaving Thompson to contemplate the difference between leadership and authority, between power and responsibility, between the soldier he had been that morning and the soldier he needed to become, if he wanted to deserve the uniform he wore. Rodriguez, the desk sergeant who had processed Elena's entry that morning, watched her sign out with the same methodical precision she had demonstrated throughout her time at the facility. But now he noticed details that had escaped his attention earlier. The way she held her pen, the small scars on her knuckles that spoke of close-quarters combat training, the calluses on her hands that came from weapons handling under extreme conditions. He had seen marks like that before on the hands of special operations personnel who flew classified missions that never appeared in official reports. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said quietly as she prepared to leave, "thank you for the work you did here today. The evaluations, the assessments. Good work." Coming from Rodriguez, who had processed thousands of contractors over his 22-year career, that was significant recognition. The kind of professional respect that got remembered in duty stations and repeated during performance reviews. Elena handed back her visitor credentials and temporary facility access card. "Thank you, Sergeant. Take care of those young soldiers. They're going to need experienced NCOs like you to help them develop into the kind of leaders the military actually needs." As Elena walked out into the Texas heat, the facility behind her returned to its normal rhythms of training and preparation. But something fundamental had changed in that space, something that would influence conversations and decision-making for months to come. The junior personnel who had participated in her humiliation had learned lessons about respect and assumptions that would shape their future behavior toward contractors, civilians, and anyone else they might be tempted to mistreat. The senior personnel who had observed her professional competence had gained new appreciation for the expertise that civilian contractors could bring to military operations, and new understanding of the importance of treating all personnel with dignity, regardless of their apparent status or background. And Commander Mitchell had filed a report that would ensure Elena's recommendations were implemented not just at Fort Braxton, but at training facilities throughout the military system where similar psychological challenges affected unit readiness and mission effectiveness. At 1500 hours, Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson stood outside Commander Mitchell's office, his dress uniform immaculate, but his confidence completely shattered. His immediate supervisor, Technical Sergeant Angela Mills, waited beside him with the kind of expression that said this conversation was going to permanently alter someone's military trajectory. Master Sergeant Patricia Davis had been called in as a witness, and Captain Robert Chun from the Inspector General's office sat quietly in the corner with a digital recorder and a notepad that would document everything said during the next hour. "Just remember," Mills whispered as they waited for Mitchell to call them in, "tell the complete truth. Don't try to justify your actions or minimize what happened. Don't blame anyone else for your decisions. And don't make excuses about protocols you think you were following, because we both know there are no protocols that authorize what you did today." The door opened. Mitchell's aide gestured them into an office that felt more like a courtroom than an administrative space. Mitchell sat behind her desk with the kind of controlled fury that experienced military officers developed when dealing with personnel who had violated the fundamental principles of military service. The meeting lasted 45 minutes, during which Thompson's version of events was dissected, analyzed, and compared against witness statements from every person who had observed the incident. When Thompson emerged from the office, his face was pale and his military career had been fundamentally redirected. Reduction in rank to corporal, forfeiture of 2 months' pay, 60 days of additional duty consisting primarily of facility maintenance and administrative tasks, mandatory enrollment in a professional conduct course that would consume his off-duty hours for the next 6 months, and a letter of reprimand that would follow him to every duty station for the remainder of his enlistment. But the administrative consequences were just the beginning of Thompson's punishment. The real penalties were already spreading through the facility in that particular way that military justice worked when someone violated the unwritten codes that held military culture together. By evening chow, every training instructor and senior NCO at Fort Braxton had heard some version of what happened in the facility that afternoon. The story varied in specific details, but the core narrative remained consistent across all versions. A contractor had been sexually harassed and humiliated by junior personnel, who had assumed she was vulnerable and powerless, and that contractor had turned out to be someone whose military service was classified at levels most people couldn't comprehend. Someone whose psychological expertise was being used to evaluate personnel for missions that officially didn't exist. Master Sergeant Davis found Thompson in the enlisted dining facility that evening, staring at a meal he wasn't eating while other personnel at nearby tables discussed his situation in voices just loud enough for him to hear every word. Davis settled into the chair across from him without asking permission, her expression showing the kind of disappointment that was more devastating than anger. "You understand what you did today, son?" she asked quietly. Thompson looked up from his untouched food, his eyes showing the kind of confusion that came from having your entire worldview challenged in a single afternoon. "Everyone keeps asking me that question, and I honestly don't know how to answer it anymore. Because everyone wants to make sure you understand the magnitude of your failure," Davis replied. "That woman you humiliated today represents everything. This military is supposed to protect and support someone who sacrificed more for this country than most people will ever know. Someone whose service record is classified because the operations she participated in were so sensitive that even acknowledging they happened could compromise national security." Davis paused, watching Thompson's face as he began to grasp the implications of his actions. "You took someone who had earned the right to be treated with the highest levels of professional respect, and you turned her into entertainment for a group of junior enlisted personnel who don't know enough about military service to recognize competence when they see it." Thompson was quiet for several minutes, processing information that challenged everything he thought he understood about authority, respect, and military hierarchy. How was I supposed to know who she was? She looked like any other civilian contractor. Her credentials didn't say anything about special operations or classified service. "That's exactly the point," Davis said, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining fundamental concepts to a confused student. "You don't know who you're dealing with until you take the time to find out. And by then, it's usually too late to make a first impression that demonstrates the kind of leader you actually are instead of the kind of person you think you want to be." Across the dining facility, Corporal Morrison and Private Chang sat at a corner table, discussing the day's events in voices that carried just enough to be overheard by personnel at surrounding tables. Chang had spent the last 4 hours in interviews with security personnel, IT specialists, and representatives from the Inspector General's office, all of whom wanted to ensure that his deleted video recording hadn't been copied, shared, or uploaded to any social media platforms. "My phone's been completely forensically examined," Chang said quietly. "They pulled the memory, checked every backup service, verified that nothing was saved to cloud storage. I think they're satisfied that the recording is actually gone, but they made it very clear that if any version of that video ever surfaces anywhere, I'll be spending the next several years in military prison." Morrison pushed his food around his plate without eating, still processing the realization that he had participated in the harassment of someone whose military service was classified beyond his security clearance level. "What do you think she actually did? I mean, what kind of operations require that level of classification? What kind of psychological work gets buried so deep that even knowing about it could compromise national security?" Chang shook his head, his expression showing the kind of sobered understanding that came from brushing against consequences that could have destroyed his entire future. "I don't want to know. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to speculate about it. I just want to forget this day ever happened and make sure I never make assumptions about people again." Technical Sergeant Mills found herself in an uncomfortable conversation with her own supervisor later that evening, explaining how one of her training personnel had managed to sexually harass a contractor whose background was classified at levels that required congressional notification. The conversation lasted an hour and resulted in Mills being assigned additional responsibilities for monitoring and training junior personnel in appropriate conduct toward civilian contractors and military personnel from other units. "The problem," her supervisor explained, "is that this incident reflects poorly on our entire training program. It suggests that we're not adequately preparing our personnel to recognize and respect the contributions of people whose service might not be immediately obvious from their current assignment or apparent status." Mills nodded, understanding that Thompson's behavior had created problems that extended far beyond his individual punishment. "What changes do we need to implement to prevent similar incidents in the future?" The question led to a comprehensive review of training protocols, professional conduct standards, and supervisory oversight procedures that would affect every person assigned to Fort Braxton's training operations. Meanwhile, Major Hendricks was completing her own report about the day's events, documenting Elena's professional competence and the valuable insights she had provided during her psychological evaluations. Hendricks had been initially annoyed at being assigned as an escort officer, viewing the duty as an unnecessary distraction from her regular administrative responsibilities, but her afternoon with Elena had provided educational opportunities that weren't available through normal military psychology training programs. She had observed interview techniques that demonstrated a level of understanding about human behavior that went far beyond what most military counselors possessed, and she had learned assessment methods that could be applied to her own work with personnel who had been exposed to classified operations and psychological stressors. Her recommendations for modifications to our stress inoculation protocols are brilliant, Hendricks wrote in her report to Mitchell. She identified patterns in our training program that were creating unnecessary psychological pressure points, and her suggested adjustments could significantly improve our personnel retention rates while maintaining the effectiveness of our preparation methods. The report continued with detailed analysis of Elena's evaluation techniques, her insights into military psychology, and her recommendations for systemic improvements that could benefit training operations throughout the military system. Hendricks concluded her documentation with a strong recommendation that Elena be brought back for follow-up evaluations and that her assessment methods be studied for potential implementation in other training facilities. Commander Mitchell reviewed Hendricks' report along with the formal documentation from Thompson's disciplinary hearing, Elena's psychological assessment findings, and security reports confirming that Chang's video recording had been completely eliminated. The combined paperwork painted a picture of an incident that had revealed both serious problems with personnel conduct and valuable opportunities for improving training effectiveness. Mitchell's own report to her superior officers emphasized the positive outcomes that had emerged from the day's events. Elena's psychological evaluations had identified personnel who needed immediate mental health intervention, recommendations that could prevent serious behavioral problems before they affected unit cohesion, and systematic improvements that could enhance the overall effectiveness of military training operations. The contractor's work exceeded expectations in every measurable category, Mitchell wrote. Her assessment techniques demonstrated a level of expertise that suggests extensive experience with military psychology under operational conditions. Her recommendations for training modifications show deep understanding of how psychological factors affect military performance and unit readiness. But Mitchell's report also acknowledged the serious conduct violations that had occurred and the steps being taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. The harassment of the contractor by junior personnel represents a failure in our professional conduct training and supervisory oversight. We are implementing enhanced protocols for interaction with civilian contractors, particularly those whose background and qualifications may not be immediately apparent from their current assignment. The ripple effects of the day's events continued spreading through Fort Braxton's professional networks as senior personnel discussed the incident during evening briefings and informal conversations. The story was becoming a teaching moment, a case study in the importance of treating all personnel with professional respect, regardless of their apparent status or background. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had witnessed the entire incident from his position at the main desk, found himself fielding questions from other senior NCOs who wanted to understand what had happened and what lessons could be learned from Thompson's mistakes. Rodriguez had seen enough classified operations during his 22-year career to recognize when someone's background was more significant than their current assignment suggested. The thing people need to understand, Rodriguez explained during a late evening conversation with his counterparts, is that you never know who you're dealing with in this business. That quiet contractor could be someone who saved lives in operations you'll never hear about. That maintenance worker could be a former special operations technician who's doing civilian work because their real service record is too classified to appear on normal employment applications. The conversation continued with Rodriguez sharing observations about Elena's professional demeanor, her assessment techniques, and the respect she had earned from senior personnel who understood competence when they saw it. She handled Thompson's harassment with more dignity and professionalism than most people could manage under those circumstances. Never lost her temper, never demanded apologies, just did her job with the kind of quiet excellence that makes experienced soldiers take notice. By the time the facility secured for the evening, word of the day's events had reached every training unit, administrative office, and support facility at Fort Braxton. The story was becoming part of the installation's institutional memory, a cautionary tale about the importance of professional conduct and the dangers of making assumptions about people whose true qualifications might not be immediately apparent, but more importantly, The incident was creating opportunities for meaningful improvements in how military personnel interacted with civilian contractors, visiting personnel from other units, and anyone else who might not fit the standard expectations of what military competence looked like. Elena's brief presence at Fort Braxton had exposed weaknesses in professional conduct, training while simultaneously demonstrating the value of expertise that came from operational experience rather than academic credentials. The lessons learned from Thompson's failure would influence training protocols, supervisory practices, and professional development programs for years to come, ensuring that future military personnel would be better prepared to recognize and respect the contributions of people whose service might not be immediately obvious from their current assignment or apparent status. 3 weeks later, when the next civilian contractor arrived at Fort Braxton for routine training evaluations, the atmosphere in the facility had undergone a fundamental transformation. Dr. James Peterson, a sports psychologist contracted to assess physical training protocols, was greeted with professional courtesy, helpful assistance, and respectful attention to his credentials and requirements. The junior personnel who processed his entry asked appropriate questions about his qualifications instead of making assumptions about his expertise, offered practical support instead of bureaucratic obstacles, and treated his work as valuable contribution to military readiness rather than unwelcome civilian interference. The change wasn't superficial or temporary. It reflected a deeper shift in institutional culture that had spread through every level of Fort Braxton's operations since Elena's visit. Training instructors now included specific modules about professional conduct toward civilian contractors in their orientation programs for new personnel. Senior NCOs made a point of observing interactions between junior soldiers and visiting specialists, intervening immediately when they detected attitudes or behaviors that suggested disrespect or inappropriate assumptions. Master Sergeant Davis had incorporated the lessons from Elena's experience into her professional development curriculum for training personnel. Not the specific details of what had happened, which remained classified at levels that required careful handling, but the broader principles about recognizing competence, treating people with dignity, and understanding that military expertise came in many different forms and from many different backgrounds. The key lesson, Davis explained during a training session for newly assigned personnel, is that quiet professionalism often indicates more significant experience than loud authority. People who have actually done difficult jobs under extreme conditions rarely feel the need to announce their qualifications or demand recognition for their service. They just show up, do excellent work, and leave things better than they found them. The training continued with practical exercises in professional communication, appropriate behavior toward contractors and visiting personnel, and recognition of different types of military expertise. Davis emphasized that assumptions about people's backgrounds or qualifications were not just unprofessional, but potentially dangerous to mission effectiveness and unit cohesion. Colonel Mitchell had used Elena's psychological assessment report as the foundation for systematic improvements to Fort Braxton's training protocols. Elena's recommendations for modifications to stress inoculation procedures had been implemented across all training units, resulting in measurable improvements in personnel retention rates and psychological readiness scores. Her insights into the relationship between leadership development and mental health had led to enhanced programs for preparing junior officers and NCOs for positions of increased responsibility. But perhaps most importantly, Elena's assessment techniques were being studied and adapted for use by other military psychologists throughout the training command. Her methods for identifying early warning signs of combat stress, her approaches to evaluating personnel for classified operations, and her strategies for helping soldiers process traumatic experiences were becoming standard elements of military psychology training programs. Mitchell's quarterly report to higher headquarters included Detailed analysis of these improvements and their measurable impact on training effectiveness. Implementation of contractor recommendations has resulted in a 15% improvement in psychological readiness scores, a 12% reduction in training-related stress casualties, and a 20% improvement in leadership development. Program completion rates. She wrote, the report continued with specific examples of how Elena's assessment methods had identified and addressed psychological issues that might otherwise have gone undetected until they became serious problems, affecting individual soldiers and unit effectiveness. Mitchell concluded her analysis with a strong recommendation that Elena's techniques be evaluated for implementation at other training facilities throughout the military system. Meanwhile, Elena herself had returned to her normal routine of traveling between different military installations, conducting psychological evaluations for personnel who required specialized assessment due to their involvement in classified operations or exposure to unusual combat stressors. Her work took her to facilities where her expertise was quietly appreciated by people who understood the value of her experience without needing to know the specific details of her classified service record. At Fort Campbell, she evaluated special operations personnel who were being prepared for deployment to regions where psychological warfare and advanced interrogation techniques were critical mission requirements. Her assessments helped identify soldiers who possessed the mental resilience necessary for operations that would test their psychological limits, while screening out personnel who might be vulnerable to the specific stressors they would encounter. In classified environments. At Naval Air Station Oceana, she worked with pilots and aircrew who flew missions that officially didn't exist, helping them process the psychological challenges of conducting operations where mission success depended on their ability to maintain operational security even under extreme pressure. Her evaluations included assessment of their ability to compartmentalize classified information, their resilience to interrogation techniques, and their capacity to maintain psychological stability during extended periods of isolation and stress. At Ramstein Air Base in Germany, she conducted evaluations for intelligence personnel who worked with information so sensitive that even their family members weren't allowed to know the general nature of their duties. Elena's assessments helped determine which personnel possessed the psychological characteristics necessary for handling the mental stress of working with intelligence that could affect national security, international relations, and the lives of assets operating in hostile territories. Each assignment reinforced Elena's understanding that her work served a purpose that extended far beyond routine psychological evaluation. She was helping to identify and prepare personnel for missions that required exceptional mental strength, psychological flexibility, and the ability to maintain operational effectiveness under conditions that would break most people's capacity to function. Her assessments were contributing to the success of operations that protected American interests around the world, even though the general public would never know about the missions or the people who carried them out. But Elena's work also served another important function that she rarely discussed with the people who contracted her services. Her presence at military facilities helped identify systemic problems with how personnel were treated, how professional conduct was maintained, and how institutional culture either supported or undermined the psychological well-being of the people who served in classified roles. The incident at Fort Braxton hadn't been unique. Elena had encountered similar problems at other facilities, where junior personnel had treated her with disrespect or inappropriate behavior, because they assumed she was just another civilian contractor without significant military background. Each incident provided opportunities for education and improvement, but they also revealed patterns of institutional behavior that could affect the treatment of other personnel who didn't fit standard expectations of what military competence looked like. Elena's informal reports to the contracting agencies that employed her included observations about facility culture, professional conduct standards, and leadership effectiveness that helped identify installations where additional training or oversight might be necessary. Her insights contributed to improvements in how military facilities prepared their personnel to work with civilian contractors, visiting specialists, and personnel from other units whose backgrounds or qualifications might not be immediately apparent. 6 months after her visit to Fort Braxton, Elena received a request to return for follow-up evaluations with the personnel she had originally assessed. The request came through official channels, but it included a personal note from Commander Mitchell, expressing appreciation for Elena's previous work and enthusiasm for continuing their professional collaboration. Elena's return visit to Fort Braxton demonstrated the lasting impact of her original experience at the facility. The personnel who greeted her showed immediate recognition of her expertise and value, treating her arrival as an opportunity to learn from someone whose knowledge could improve their own professional effectiveness. The junior soldiers who had participated in her original humiliation were notably absent from the facility, having been transferred to assignments where their conduct could be more closely supervised and their professional development could be carefully managed. Staff Sergeant Thompson, who had been the primary instigator of Elena's harassment, was serving his reduced rank at a different installation, where his duties consisted primarily of administrative tasks that kept him away from direct contact with civilian contractors or visiting personnel. His new assignment included mandatory participation in professional conduct training, regular counseling sessions with senior NCOs, and close supervision of all his interactions with personnel from outside his immediate unit. The transformation at Fort Braxton extended beyond simple improvements in how civilian contractors were treated. Elena's original assessment recommendations had led to comprehensive changes in training protocols, leadership development programs, and psychological support services that had improved the overall effectiveness of the facility's mission. Personnel retention rates had improved, psychological readiness scores had increased, and the facility had gained recognition from higher headquarters for innovations in training methodology and personnel development. Master Sergeant Davis approached Elena during her return visit with a request that demonstrated the lasting impact of her previous work. "Ma'am, would you be willing to conduct a training session for our senior NCOs about advanced psychological assessment techniques? We've implemented your recommendations from last time, and we'd like to learn more about how to identify and address psychological issues before they become serious problems." The request represented a significant evolution in how the facility viewed Elena's expertise. Rather than treating her as an outside contractor whose work was separate from their normal operations, they were recognizing her as a resource whose knowledge could enhance their own professional capabilities. Elena's willingness to share her expertise demonstrated her commitment to improving military effectiveness rather than simply completing contracted assignments. During her 3-day return visit, Elena conducted advanced training sessions for TISs for SOL. Senior personnel provided updated assessments for the soldiers she had originally evaluated, and offered recommendations for further improvements to the facility's psychological support programs. Her work reinforced the positive changes that had occurred since her original visit while identifying additional opportunities for enhancing the facility's effectiveness and preparing personnel for demanding military assignments. The junior personnel who interacted with Elena during her return visit showed markedly different behavior from what she had encountered during her original assessment. They treated her with professional respect, asked appropriate questions about her work, and demonstrated genuine interest in learning from her expertise. The culture change at Fort Braxton had created an environment where competence was recognized and valued regardless of its source, and where professional conduct was maintained as a fundamental requirement rather than an optional courtesy. Elena's final report from her return visit documented the sustained improvements at Fort Braxton and recommended the facility as a model for how military installations could effectively integrate civilian expertise while maintaining appropriate security and professional standards. Her observations contributed to policy recommendations that were implemented at facilities throughout the military training system, ensuring that the lessons learned from her experience would benefit personnel and operations far beyond the boundaries of Fort Braxton itself. 1 year after Elena's initial visit to Fort Braxton, her reputation within the specialized community of military psychology contractors had evolved into something approaching legend. Word traveled through the classified channels that connected facilities conducting sensitive operations, carrying stories about a contractor whose assessment capabilities exceeded anything available through normal military psychology programs. Installation commanders began specifically requesting Elena's services for their most challenging evaluation requirements, understanding that her expertise could identify and address psychological issues that other specialists might miss entirely. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The demand for Elena's services had grown to the point where her contracting agency needed to carefully prioritize requests from different facilities, ensuring that her time was allocated to the missions where her unique capabilities could provide the greatest benefit to national security operations. Elena found herself working primarily with personnel who were being prepared for assignments that required exceptional psychological resilience, deep cover intelligence operatives, special operations teams conducting extended missions in hostile territories, and psychological warfare specialists whose work involved manipulating enemy decision-making processes. At Fort Huachuca, Elena evaluated intelligence analysts who were being prepared for assignments where they would be exposed to information so psychologically disturbing that normal screening procedures couldn't adequately assess their ability to process the material without suffering permanent psychological damage. Her assessments helped identify personnel who possessed the specific mental characteristics necessary for analyzing intelligence related to human trafficking networks, terrorist psychological operations, and enemy torture techniques without becoming compromised by exposure to extreme human cruelty. The evaluation process for these assignments required Elena to probe deeper into psychological makeup than normal military assessments allowed. She needed to understand not just whether someone could handle stress, but whether they could maintain emotional stability while being exposed to the absolute worst aspects of human behavior on a daily basis. Her interview techniques included scenarios designed to test empathy responses, moral flexibility, and the ability to compartmentalize disturbing information without becoming desensitized to human suffering. Elena's reports from Fort Huachuca identified 3 intelligence analysts who required immediate reassignment to different duties because their psychological profiles indicated they would be vulnerable to secondary trauma from exposure to the intelligence materials they would be required to process. Her assessments also revealed that the facility's support programs for personnel in these assignments needed significant enhancement to prevent long-term psychological damage to people whose work required them to study the darkest aspects of human nature. At MacDill Air Force Base, Elena worked with personnel who were being prepared for psychological operations, missions that involved infiltrating enemy organizations and manipulating their decision-making processes through carefully crafted deception campaigns. These assignments required individuals who could maintain multiple false identities simultaneously, resist interrogation techniques designed to break their psychological defenses, and operate for extended periods without external support or validation of their real identity. The psychological requirements for these missions were unlike anything addressed by standard military training. Elena's evaluations needed to assess not just mental toughness or stress resistance, but the specific psychological flexibility required to maintain sanity while living lies so complete that the operators themselves sometimes struggled to remember which identity represented their true self. Her assessment protocols included tests for dissociative resilience, identity stability under extreme pressure, and the ability to maintain moral grounding while engaging in deception activities that could last for months or years. Elena identified 2 operators whose psychological profiles indicated they were unsuitable for deep cover assignments because their personality structures required external validation and social connection that wouldn't be available during extended deception missions. Her recommendations led to their reassignment to different psychological operations roles where their talents could be utilized without exposing them to psychological risks that could result in permanent mental health consequences. At Naval Support Activity Suda Bay in Greece, Elena evaluated personnel who were being prepared for maritime psychological operations that involved working with foreign assets, whose reliability and mental stability were unknown variables. These assignments required operators who could quickly assess the psychological state of potential sources, identify signs of mental instability or enemy manipulation, and maintain their own psychological equilibrium while working with people whose behavior might be unpredictable or potentially dangerous. The evaluation process for maritime psychological operations required Elena to assess cultural sensitivity, linguistic psychological awareness, and the ability to build trust with people from different cultural backgrounds while maintaining appropriate operational security. Her interviews included scenarios designed to test cross-cultural empathy, the ability to detect deception across language barriers, and psychological resilience when working with assets who might be compromised, unreliable, or actively working for hostile intelligence services. Elena's assessments at Suda Bay revealed significant gaps in the facility's preparation programs for cross-cultural psychological operations. Her recommendations led to enhanced training protocols that better prepared operators for the psychological challenges of working with foreign assets, improved support programs for personnel operating in culturally isolated environments, and better screening procedures for identifying operators who possessed the cultural sensitivity necessary for effective international psychological operations. The pattern of Elena's work had established her as the premier specialist for psychological evaluations related to the most sensitive and demanding military assignments. Her expertise was being utilized to identify and prepare personnel for missions that pushed the boundaries of human psychological endurance, required exceptional mental flexibility, and involved exposure to psychological stressors that could permanently damage inadequately prepared individuals. But Elena's growing reputation also brought increased scrutiny from security agencies, concerned about maintaining the classification levels that protected her own background and the operations she had participated in during her active military service. Her presence at multiple classified facilities, her access to personnel being prepared for sensitive missions, and her knowledge of assessment techniques that weren't available through normal military training programs made her a potential security risk that required careful management. Elena's contracting agency received instructions to implement enhanced security protocols for her assignments, including more detailed background investigations, regular polygraph examinations, and restrictions on her ability to discuss her work with personnel who didn't possess appropriate security clearances. The measures were designed to protect both Elena's safety and the operational security of the mission she was helping to support, but they also created additional administrative burden that complicated the process of scheduling her services. Security enhancements included requirements for Elena to report any attempts by foreign nationals to make contact with her, any unusual interest in her work from people outside the military psychology community, and any changes in her personal circumstances that might affect her reliability or create vulnerabilities that hostile intelligence services could exploit. Elena understood that these measures were necessary consequences of her specialized role, but they also served as constant reminders that her work existed in a shadow world where normal professional relationships were complicated by security considerations that most people never encountered. Elena's personal life had been increasingly shaped by the requirements of maintaining appropriate security for her professional activities. Her social relationships were limited to people who either possessed security clearances or were completely uninvolved in government or military activities. Her residential choices were influenced by proximity to military facilities and the need to maintain communication security. Her travel patterns were designed to avoid creating predictable routines that could be exploited by hostile intelligence services interested in her activities or background. The isolation that came with Elena's professional responsibilities was offset by the knowledge that her work was contributing to the success of operations that protected American interests and personnel around the world. Her psychological assessments were helping to identify and prepare the most capable individuals for missions that required exceptional mental strength and psychological flexibility. Her recommendations were improving training protocols and support programs that enhance the effectiveness of personnel conducting the most sensitive and demanding military assignments. Elena's reports from her various assignments were contributing to a growing body of knowledge about the psychological requirements for different types of classified military operations. Her insights were being used to develop improved screening procedures, enhanced training protocols, and better support programs for personnel whose assignments exposed them to psychological stressors that weren't addressed by conventional military preparation. The cumulative impact of Elena's work extended far beyond the individual assessments she conducted at different facilities. Her expertise was helping to advance the entire field of military psychology, particularly in areas related to personnel selection and preparation for classified operations. Her assessment techniques were being studied and adapted by other military psychologists. Her recommendations were influencing policy development at the highest levels of military command, and her insights were contributing to improvements in how the military identified and supported personnel who conducted the most psychologically demanding aspects of national defense. Elena's professional reputation had reached the point where her availability had become a limiting factor in the military's ability to properly assess personnel for certain types of sensitive assignments. The demand for her services exceeded what one person could reasonably provide, leading to discussions about how her expertise could be transferred to other specialists or incorporated into institutional training programs that could expand the military's capacity for conducting psychological evaluations at the level of sophistication that Elena's work represented. The challenge of expanding Elena's impact while maintaining appropriate security for her background and methods had become a priority for the agencies that managed her contracting arrangements. They needed to find ways to utilize her expertise more efficiently, while ensuring that the classified aspects of her knowledge and experience remained protected from unauthorized disclosure or compromise by hostile intelligence services. Elena's understanding of these challenges had led her to begin developing training materials and assessment protocols that could be used by other military psychologists without revealing the classified sources of her expertise. Her goal was to create resources that would allow the military to conduct more sophisticated psychological evaluations for sensitive assignments, while maintaining appropriate security for the operational details that had informed her assessment techniques. The process of developing these training materials required Elena to carefully extract the practical applications of her knowledge, while avoiding any disclosure of the classified operations or techniques that had provided the foundation for her expertise. She needed to create assessment protocols that were effective and reliable, without revealing the specific circumstances under which she had learned to recognize different types of psychological strengths and vulnerabilities. Elena's work on expanding the military's psychological assessment capabilities represented a new phase in her post-military career, one that offered the potential to multiply her impact on national security operations while reducing the personal burden of conducting individual evaluations at facilities throughout the world. Her efforts to transfer her expertise to other specialists would allow her to contribute to military effectiveness on a broader scale while maintaining the security requirements that protected both her safety and the classified aspects of her background. 2 years after the Fort Braxton incident, Elena received an assignment that would challenge every aspect of her professional expertise and personal resilience. The request came through the most secure channels available to her contracting agency, carrying classification levels that required special congressional notification and involving personnel whose identities were protected by executive privilege. She was being asked to conduct psychological evaluations for a joint task force that was being assembled for an operation so sensitive that even the briefing materials were restricted to facilities with specialized security infrastructure. The assignment location was Joint Base Andrews, but Elena's work would be conducted in underground facilities that didn't appear on any public maps or architectural plans. The personnel she would be evaluating represented the most elite elements from every branch of military service. Navy SEALs who had participated in operations that were classified beyond top secret, Army Special Forces operators whose service records were compartmentalized at levels that required presidential authorization to access, Air Force pararescue specialists who had conducted missions in territories where American military presence was officially denied, and Marine Force reconnaissance operatives whose assignments had involved activities that couldn't be acknowledged without compromising ongoing intelligence operations. Elena's preliminary briefing for the assignment took place in a secure communication facility, where she was required to surrender all personal electronic devices, submit to comprehensive security screening, and sign documentation that made her legally responsible for maintaining operational security at levels that carried potential criminal penalties for any violation. The briefing officer, a colonel whose name wasn't provided and whose uniform bore no identifying insignia, explained that Elena would be assessing personnel for an operation that would require them to maintain psychological stability under conditions that had never been encountered by American military forces. The mission parameters are unlike anything we've previously attempted, the colonel explained, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the full implications of what he was describing. The personnel selected for this operation will be operating independently for extended periods, potentially months, in environments where they will have no communication with command authority, no logistical support, and no possibility of extraction if their mission is compromised. The psychological requirements for the operation exceeded anything addressed by existing military assessment protocols. Elena would need to evaluate not just mental toughness or stress resistance, but the specific psychological characteristics that would allow individuals to maintain operational effectiveness while completely isolated from all support systems, facing unknown threats, and operating under conditions where traditional military training and procedures might not provide adequate guidance for decision-making. Elena's assessment protocols for the assignment required her to develop entirely new evaluation techniques that could predict psychological performance under conditions that had never been studied or documented by military psychology research. She needed to assess psychological independence, decision-making capability under extreme uncertainty, and the ability to maintain mission focus while experiencing the kind of isolation that could trigger severe psychological deterioration in inadequately prepared individuals. The evaluation process took place over 6 weeks, during which Elena conducted intensive interviews with 47 candidates who had been pre-selected based on their performance in previous classified operations. Each interview session lasted between 4 and 8 hours, involving psychological stress testing, scenario-based decision-making assessments, and evaluation of personality characteristics that weren't measured by standard military psychology instruments. Elena's interview techniques for this assignment pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in military psychological evaluation. She subjected candidates to simulated psychological pressures that replicated the isolation, uncertainty, and moral ambiguity they would encounter during the actual operation. Her assessments included evaluation of their ability to maintain psychological coherence while making life-and-death decisions without access to command guidance, superior officers, or operational support that normally provided psychological stability for military personnel. The candidates Elena was evaluating represented the absolute elite of American military capability, but her assessments revealed that exceptional combat skills and previous operational success didn't necessarily correlate with the psychological characteristics required for the mission they were being considered for. Several candidates who had performed brilliantly in previous special operations assignments showed psychological profiles that indicated they would be vulnerable to mental breakdown under the extreme isolation and uncertainty that characterized the proposed mission parameters. Elena's preliminary findings identified 12 candidates whose psychological makeup indicated they possessed the specific mental characteristics necessary for independent operation under the extreme conditions described in the mission briefing. These individuals demonstrated psychological resilience that went beyond normal measures of mental toughness, including the ability to maintain rational decision-making processes while experiencing severe social isolation, the capacity to adapt their behavioral strategies when confronted with completely unfamiliar challenges, and the psychological flexibility necessary to maintain operational effectiveness without external validation or support. But Elena's assessments also revealed disturbing patterns in the psychological profiles of personnel who were being considered for missions that pushed the boundaries of human psychological endurance. Many of the candidates showed signs of psychological adaptation to extreme stress that had been achieved through experiences that had fundamentally altered their emotional responses, social relationships, and connection to civilian society. Their psychological resilience had been developed through exposure to trauma and isolation that had created capabilities necessary for exceptional military performance while simultaneously damaging their ability to maintain normal human relationships and emotional connections. Elena's reports from the Joint Base Andrews assignment included recommendations for enhanced psychological support programs for personnel whose assignments required them to develop psychological characteristics that were incompatible with normal social functioning. She identified the need for specialized counseling services that could help elite military personnel maintain psychological health while developing the mental adaptations necessary for the most demanding operational assignments. The classified nature of Elena's work at Joint Base Andrews meant that her findings and recommendations couldn't be shared with conventional military psychology researchers or incorporated into normal professional development programs. Her insights into the psychological requirements for extreme military operations remained compartmentalized within the intelligence community, limiting their potential contribution to broader understanding of military psychology and human performance under extreme conditions. Elena's personal response to the Joint Base Andrews assignment reflected the cumulative psychological impact of her years conducting evaluations for personnel involved in classified military operations. Her exposure to the psychological profiles of individuals who had been shaped by experiences at the extremes of human endurance had provided her with insights into military psychology that weren't available through conventional research or clinical practice, but it had also exposed her to psychological material that challenged her own emotional stability and professional objectivity. The candidates Elena evaluated at Joint Base Andrews represented psychological case studies in how human beings adapted to conditions that exceeded normal parameters of stress, isolation, and moral complexity. Their psychological profiles revealed the mental costs of developing capabilities necessary for the most extreme military assignments, including emotional detachment that protected them from psychological trauma while simultaneously limiting their capacity for normal human connection, and social relationships. Elena's assessment work required her to maintain professional objectivity while evaluating psychological characteristics that represented both extraordinary human capability and the mental cost of developing such capabilities through exposure to extreme operational conditions. Her interviews with candidates involved detailed exploration of psychological adaptations that had been achieved through experiences that would be considered traumatic by normal clinical standards, but which were necessary components of preparation for military assignments that pushed the boundaries of human psychological endurance. The psychological profiles Elena documented during her Joint Base Andrews assignment provided unique insights into how human psychology adapted to conditions that exceeded normal research parameters, but the classified nature of her work meant that these insights couldn't contribute to broader understanding of human psychological resilience or inform therapeutic approaches for helping people recover from extreme trauma experiences. Elena's final report from the Joint Base Andrews assignment identified the 12 candidates whose psychological profiles indicated they possessed the specific characteristics necessary for the proposed operation. But it also included detailed recommendations for psychological support services that could help maintain the mental health of personnel whose assignments required them to operate at the extremes of human psychological endurance. The operational requirements that Elena had been evaluating personnel for represented a new category of military assignment that pushed beyond previously established parameters for human psychological performance. The mission would require individuals to maintain operational effectiveness while experiencing conditions that had never been encountered by American military forces, operating independently for extended periods without communication, support, or possibility of extraction if their activities were compromised by hostile forces. Elena understood that her role in selecting personnel for such missions carried moral responsibilities that extended beyond professional competence in psychological assessment. Her evaluations would directly influence which individuals would be exposed to psychological risks that could result in permanent mental health consequences, and her assessment accuracy could determine whether the operation succeeded or failed, with potentially significant implications for national security. The weight of these responsibilities had become increasingly difficult for Elena to manage as her expertise led to assignments involving ever more extreme operational requirements and psychological challenges. Her professional success in identifying personnel capable of exceptional military performance had resulted in requests for her services in evaluating candidates for missions that pushed the boundaries of what could be reasonably asked of human beings. Even those who had volunteered for military service and demonstrated exceptional psychological resilience. Elena's work at Joint Base Andrews represented both the pinnacle of her professional expertise and a turning point in her understanding of the personal costs associated with her specialized role in military psychology. The psychological profile she had documented during the assignment provided unprecedented insights into human adaptation to extreme conditions, but they had also exposed her to psychological material that challenged her own emotional stability and professional objectivity in ways that couldn't be addressed through normal therapeutic or professional support services. The classified nature of Elena's work meant that she couldn't discuss the psychological challenges of her assignments with conventional mental health professionals, and the specialized nature of her expertise meant that few people possessed the background necessary to understand the professional and personal challenges associated with conducting psychological evaluations for the most extreme military assignments. Isolation from normal professional support networks had been a necessary consequence of maintaining appropriate security for her work, but it had also created psychological challenges that were becoming increasingly difficult to manage as her assignments evolved. Ever more extreme operational requirements and psychological assessment challenges. The completion of Elena's assignment at Joint Base Andrews marked a critical juncture in her career as a military psychology contractor, but it also initiated a series of events that would fundamentally challenge her ability to maintain the carefully constructed boundaries between her professional responsibilities and personal psychological well-being. The 12 candidates she had selected for the classified operation represented individuals whose psychological profiles indicated they could maintain operational effectiveness under conditions that exceeded normal parameters of human endurance. But Elena's detailed knowledge of what those individuals would be required to endure had begun to affect her own mental stability in ways that she couldn't adequately address through normal support mechanisms. 3 months after submitting her final report from Joint Base Andrews, Elena received notification that the operation had been initiated and that preliminary reports indicated her personnel selections had been accurate in predicting psychological performance under the extreme conditions described in the mission parameters. The notification came through secure channels that didn't provide details about the operation's progress or the specific challenges the selected personnel were encountering. But Elena understood that her assessment work had directly contributed to placing 12 individuals in situations where their psychological resilience would be tested at levels that could result in permanent mental health consequences. Elena's professional satisfaction at the apparent success of her assessments was complicated by increasing concern about the psychological costs being borne by the individuals she had identified as capable of extreme operational performance. Her expertise in military psychology had made her acutely aware of the long-term mental health implications associated with the kinds of missions she was helping to staff, and her knowledge of the specific psychological challenges those missions involved had begun to create ethical concerns that she couldn't resolve through normal professional consultation or guidance. The classified nature of Elena's work meant that she couldn't discuss her concerns with conventional mental health professionals or military psychology colleagues who might provide perspective on the ethical implications of her assessment activities. Her isolation from normal professional support networks had been a necessary consequence of maintaining appropriate security for her specialized assignments, but it had also created a situation where Elena was bearing the psychological burden of her work without access to the collegial support that normally helped mental health professionals manage the emotional challenges associated with their responsibilities. Elena's growing concerns about the ethical implications of her work were compounded by requests for her services in evaluating personnel for additional operations that appeared to push even further beyond established parameters for acceptable risk to military personnel. The success of her assessments at Joint Base Andrews had enhanced her reputation within the intelligence community to the point where she was being considered for assignments involving psychological evaluation for operations that existed at the absolute extremes of what could be justified under military necessity and national security requirements. The psychological characteristics that Elena had identified as necessary for extreme military operations represented adaptations that were achieved through experiences that would be considered severely traumatic by conventional clinical standards. Her assessment protocols required her to evaluate individuals whose psychological resilience had been developed through exposure to conditions that had fundamentally altered their emotional responses, social relationships, and connection to civilian society in ways that enabled exceptional military performance while simultaneously creating mental health challenges that couldn't be addressed through normal therapeutic approaches. Elena's professional expertise had reached a level where she possessed unique insights into human psychological adaptation to extreme conditions. But her knowledge of the mental costs associated with developing such adaptations had begun to create personal psychological challenges that were affecting her ability to maintain the emotional detachment necessary for objective professional assessment. Her interviews with candidates for extreme military operations involved detailed exploration of psychological material that challenged her own emotional stability while requiring her to maintain professional objectivity in evaluating whether individuals should be exposed to conditions that could result in permanent mental health consequences. The cumulative psychological impact of Elena's specialized assessment work had begun to manifest in symptoms that she recognized as consistent with secondary trauma exposure. But the classified nature of her activities meant that she couldn't seek therapeutic support through normal channels without compromising operational security for ongoing missions and personnel. Elena's professional training had provided her with theoretical knowledge about the psychological risks associated with exposure to extreme trauma material, but her practical experience conducting assessments for the most extreme military operations had exposed her to psychological content that exceeded the parameters addressed by CONVENTIONAL therapeutic approaches. Elena's personal relationships had been increasingly affected by the security requirements and psychological demands associated with her specialized professional role. Her social connections were limited to people who either possessed appropriate security clearances or were completely uninvolved in government activities, and her ability to maintain intimate relationships had been compromised by her inability to discuss the professional activities that consumed most of her emotional and intellectual energy. The isolation that came with Elena's work had created personal challenges that were becoming increasingly difficult to manage without compromising the security requirements that protected both her safety and the operational effectiveness of the missions she supported. Elena's recognition that her psychological well-being was being affected by her professional activities led her to begin considering whether she could continue conducting assessments for extreme military operations without compromising either her own mental health or her professional effectiveness in identifying personnel capable of exceptional operational performance. Her expertise had become valuable enough to influence national security operations, but the personal costs associated with maintaining that expertise were approaching levels that might require her to reconsider her professional priorities and career direction. The dilemma Elena faced reflected broader challenges within the military psychology community related to maintaining adequate personnel for conducting psychological evaluations associated with the most extreme military operations. The psychological demands of assessing candidates for missions that pushed the boundaries of human endurance required specialists who possessed both exceptional professional competence and unusual personal resilience. But the mental health costs associated with such work created sustainability challenges that weren't adequately addressed by existing support systems for military psychology professionals. Elena's situation had been complicated by the exceptional level of her expertise and the classified nature of her assignments, which had created professional isolation that exceeded what most military psychologists experienced in their specialized roles. Her knowledge of assessment techniques for extreme military operations represented capabilities that were difficult to replace, but her increasing psychological concerns about the ethical implications of her work had begun to affect her professional judgment in ways that could compromise the effectiveness of her assessments. Elena's attempts to address her psychological concerns through self-directed therapeutic approaches had been limited by her inability to discuss the specific content of her professional activities with qualified mental health professionals. Her training in military psychology had provided her with theoretical frameworks for understanding her own psychological responses to extreme professional demands, but the practical challenges of managing secondary trauma exposure while maintaining operational security requirements exceeded what could be addressed through self-directed intervention approaches. The professional community within which Elena operated had begun to recognize that the psychological demands associated with conducting assessments for extreme military operations created sustainability challenges that needed to be addressed through enhanced support programs for specialists involved in such work. Elena's experience had become a case study in the need for specialized, therapeutic approaches that could address the mental health needs of professionals whose work involved exposure to psychological material that exceeded normal clinical parameters, while maintaining appropriate security for classified operational requirements. Elena's professional reputation had reached a level where her availability had become a limiting factor in the military's ability to conduct psychological assessments for certain types of extreme operations. But her increasing concerns about the personal costs associated with her work had begun to affect her willingness to accept assignments that involved the most psychologically demanding evaluation requirements. The tension between Elena's professional expertise and personal well-being had created challenges that required careful balance between maintaining her contributions to national security operations and protecting her own psychological health. Elena's understanding of the psychological costs associated with extreme military operations had been enhanced by her personal experience of the secondary trauma effects that resulted from conducting detailed assessments of personnel who had been shaped by exposure to conditions at the extremes of human endurance. Her professional knowledge had been complemented by personal insights into the mental health challenges faced by individuals whose work involved regular exposure to psychological material that challenged normal parameters of human emotional resilience. Evolution of Elena's professional perspective had been influenced by her recognition that the psychological characteristics necessary for exceptional military performance often came at personal costs that weren't adequately addressed by existing support systems for military personnel. Her assessment work had provided her with detailed understanding of how individuals adapted to extreme operational conditions, but it had also exposed her to the long-term mental health implications associated with developing psychological resilience. Through exposure to severe trauma and isolation, Elena's professional expertise had become sufficiently specialized that her assessment techniques were being studied for potential implementation in training programs for other military psychology professionals. But the classified nature of her knowledge and the personal psychological costs associated with developing such expertise created challenges in transferring her capabilities to other specialists. The process of expanding the military's capacity for conducting psychological evaluations at Elena's level of sophistication required careful consideration of how to prepare other professionals for the psychological demands associated with such specialized assessment work. Elena's career had reached a point where she needed to make fundamental decisions about whether she could continue conducting assessments for extreme military operations while maintaining her own psychological well-being and professional effectiveness. Her expertise represented capabilities that were valuable for national security operations, but the personal costs associated with maintaining that expertise had begun to exceed what she could reasonably sustain without compromising either her mental health or her professional judgment in evaluating personnel for missions that involved significant psychological risks. 6 months later, Elena made a decision that would define the remainder of her career and potentially save countless lives in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged. Standing in her modest apartment, surrounded by classified files that represented years of the most sensitive psychological assessments in military history, she placed a secure call to the contracting agency that had managed her assignments for nearly a decade. "I'm transitioning my role," she told the agency director, her voice carrying the quiet certainty that had characterized every major decision in her life. "I want to develop a comprehensive training program for military psychologists who will be conducting assessments for extreme operations. The military needs more people who can do this work, and they need to be properly prepared for the psychological costs involved." The decision represented Elena's recognition that her greatest contribution to national security wouldn't come from continuing to conduct individual assessments, but from multiplying her expertise by training other professionals who could carry on the specialized work while maintaining appropriate support systems for their own psychological well-being. Her proposal involved creating the first comprehensive program for preparing military psychologists to assess personnel for classified operations that push the boundaries of human psychological endurance. Elena's training program would be conducted at a secure facility where she could share her assessment techniques without compromising the classified sources of her expertise. The curriculum would include not just evaluation methods, but comprehensive preparation for managing the secondary trauma effects that resulted from regular exposure to extreme psychological material. Her goal was to create a sustainable model for conducting psychological assessments for the most demanding military operations while protecting the mental health of the professionals involved in such work. The program's first class consisted of 12 military psychologists who had been carefully selected based on their professional competence, psychological resilience, and security clearances that allowed them to work with classified personnel and operations. Elena's training methods combined theoretical instruction with practical exercises that prepared the participants for the emotional challenges they would encounter while conducting assessments for extreme military assignments. Elena's transition from individual contractor to training program developer represented her understanding that the most extreme military operations would continue to require psychological assessment capabilities that exceeded normal clinical parameters, but that such capabilities needed to be developed through systematic training approaches that prepared professionals for the personal challenges associated with specialized assessment work. The success of Elena's training program was measured not just by the competence of the psychologists she prepared, but by their ability to maintain their own psychological well-being while conducting assessments for operations that involved significant mental health risks for both the personnel being evaluated and the professionals conducting the evaluations. Elena's program represented the first systematic approach to addressing the sustainability challenges associated with military psychology work at the extremes of human psychological endurance. Years later, Elena's influence could be seen in psychological assessment programs throughout the military system, where her techniques were being used to identify and prepare personnel for the most demanding operational assignments while maintaining appropriate support for both the individuals being evaluated and the professionals conducting the assessments. Her legacy was written not in public recognition or official acknowledgement, but in the improved effectiveness and sustainability of psychological evaluation programs that supported the most critical national security operations. Elena had learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields, but in quiet training facilities where the next generation of professionals are prepared to carry on work that officially doesn't exist but remains essential for protecting everything we hold dear. Have you ever wondered about the hidden heroes who prepare others for impossible missions? What do you think it takes to train people for jobs that can't be discussed? Share your thoughts below. We read every comment and appreciate your perspective on these untold stories of service and sacrifice. If this story opened your eyes to the invisible warriors who serve in the shadows, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We bring you powerful true stories of courage, sacrifice, and the extraordinary people who protect our freedom in ways you never imagined. Your next incredible journey into the world of unsung heroes is waiting. Don't miss it.